No, most of them did not.
Did you swim in the
Can
lake?
you hear me all right?
Yep,
Yes.
yep.
Good. Mrs. Knight was in her late 60s when she built this home. So many of her guests were that age or older. The younger guests, relatives, and people like my parents and so forth, yes, they would swim. And that was, I've done almost every day when people were here. But the majority were older and did not go into the lake.
But did you swim regularly, Helen?
Yes, I liked the water at that time, yeah. It's
see.
cold though. Well, as far as I know, the history of the island, Emerald Bay was carved by a glacier, and the island miraculously survived right in the middle of it. So it has been there for a long time. Ben Holliday at first came into Emerald Bay and built a home here. There was a caretaker that appointed himself to be the caretaker of Emerald Bay, and he was very intrigued with the island. He went out there and built a wooden shack, even built himself a tomb because he wanted to be buried there. He capsized in a boat because he liked to imbibe and had been out to a local tavern and never made it home one night. So he was never buried there.
So what did she use it for?
So the island just stayed there. You may be interested to know, however, that the people from whom Mrs. Knight bought this property had a visitor, Frank Lloyd Wright, who was intrigued by the island, and he wanted to establish a bridge from the island to the shore, and he even drew up plans to do that, which I understand are in the Northwest somewhere in a museum now.
But there's a structure out there.
Pardon me?
There's a structure out there.
Well, then Mrs. Knight came. She bought the property, and she put the little stone castle on the island, which was referred to as a tea house. It used to have a roof, windows, and a door. It doesn't now. And it had a pathway up. It was not used often. I mentioned Mrs. Knight's age and her guests, and that's a steep climb up there to the tea house. They might go out once or twice a summer at the most. And yardmen would be positioned along the pathway at the most difficult points and would assist Mrs. Knight and her guests up to tea in that event.
Great, thank you.
Sir.
Yep.
The lake can vary. I must say I've never seen it like it is.
You haven't,
now.
okay.
I can remember as a child of having there were grasses, natural grasses that were right down to the shoreline practically. And then there would be several, out in front of the house, several feet of sand. And that was about all right in front of Vikingsholm for a number of years.
Yes.
Our guests were always invited to church. She would go on Sundays. Normally, there were occasions when she'd take her large boat and take her guests over that way. Usually, though, they drove. She had 2 limousines here and 2 chauffeurs, and they would drive the guests who cared to attend over with Mrs. Knight. And Mrs. Knight had a very good friend, and Mrs. Knight and Miss Patrick, her friend, were readers for many years in the church. She did build that church, and she was very instrumental in establishing the Christian Science Church in Santa Barbara also. Mrs. Knight would love to have guests come. When they came, it wasn't a spectacular type of visit, not a lot of parties, not a lot of entertainment. They were invited to come and just enjoy the scenery, just certainly eat well, pretty much do what they wanted. Young people who had their own cars might go somewhere on their own for the day and so forth. There was a lot of liberty as far as what people wanted to do. But a normal day would be a breakfast around 8:30. The morning people would swim, hike, or just sit and talk and enjoy the view of the bay. Lunch would be served at 12:30, all meals in the main dining room. Very sumptuous meals, very complete. They would be served by 2 serving maids each at every meal. Afternoon, it was customary after lunch to take a nap, quite often. And then people would do what they wanted to. High tea was served on the terrace out overlooking the lake at about 4 o'clock each afternoon. And there was, it was just very relaxed. Dinner at 6:30. After dinner, it was customary, quite often, everybody take a walk. They might walk up to the base of the falls, take a look at that. The trail was in a different place at that time. And one of the favorite things was to have the chauffeurs drive the limousines into the courtyard here. Mrs. Knight and the guests would get in. They'd be driven up the driveway, which is now the walking trail, for people coming down. Driven up the driveway, and then everybody'd get out and take a leisurely stroll back down.
I like that.
The bears actually did not come to Emerald Bay until the 80s. The drought at that time brought them down looking for water, and they found garbage cans and other wonderful things, campgrounds, and have been with us ever since. I've never seen deer here, with few exceptions, in the fall occasionally. We do have beaver here, and they're very active and build dams over on that side of the bay particularly. We have birds, we have eagles, ospreys, very interesting birds. As a child, the one thing that I remember the most are the porcupines. And Mrs. Knight had 2 terriers that lived here. Her friend had one, and she had another. And they were fascinated with those porcupines. And it was frequently an unpleasant exposure. But we haven't seen too many of them recently, oddly enough. So it was not a lot of wildlife. Some grandnephews. They were about my age, and as I got older, they were a sheer joy because she would hire them for the summers to come up and work here at times. And that was, they were about 2 years older, so that was a real interest in my life at that time. When I was younger, if there was nobody here, she would kindly invite a young girl to that lives in some houses just above Emerald Bay to come down and stay overnight. And I still see that friend every now and then. Well, I didn't run up and down the stairs, Larry. I was pretty well behaved. Um, when I was old enough, I always ate all the meals in the dining room, and I was sort of a novelty because I would be quite often the only child there. Mrs. Knight always had me sitting on her right so that she could talk. Quite often after dinner, one of the highlights, she'd invite me into the library, and we would have a really vicious game of double solitaire. She was an outgoing person, a very pleasant person, and of course very interesting. She'd been everywhere in my eyes, and I would behave myself. I would not think of other things. Although the grandnephews would play tricks on her, and she would go right along with it. You know, she was a pleasant person to be with. My mother had first come to know Mrs. Knight well because Mrs. Knight was a generous person. She obviously had a lot of money, and one of her great interests was to provide scholarships for women who otherwise would not have gone on to higher education. My mother was one of those. And it developed into a very close friendship, more like an adapted aunt and niece type of arrangement. And as it happened, Mrs. Knight, for those of you who may not know, owned Dollar Point before she bought the property here. And she sold that property to Stanley Dollar when she bought this. When my mother and father were married in 1928, when she went to get her ideas together for the building of this house, she opened up the house at Dollar Point for my husband, my father and mother for their honeymoon with full staff. And it was quite an experience for my father, who had never known anything quite like that. So they were good friends. And then she would invite my family up every summer.
So you spent a few months here every year?
We would normally be invited officially for 2 weeks, and then my father would have to return because he was in business in Santa Barbara. But quite often my mother and I would stay on.
You stayed till what age were you?
Till I was 14.
Till you were 14?
That was the year Mrs. Knight passed away.
Okay. So you came when you were around very young?
Yeah.
So you saw it from the beginning all the way?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
It was what we did every summer.
Yeah, great. What a better place. Huh?
I thought everybody did it. Her father was an attorney. He was well off and well respected in his community in Galena, Illinois. And she brought up, she was a family of 3 sisters and 1 brother. So she grew up with other children. I have never known, people have asked me whether she'd gone on to higher education herself. I suspect she did not. I think she probably went to a finishing school. But I don't know the answer to that. She did marry quite young, and she was in her late teens when she got married. And then she was married for many years to Mr. Moore, and they certainly had a very active life together. They traveled extensively, and he was, of course, in business quite prominent. But she was an independent person on her own. She could take care of things. The property, as I mentioned, had been owned by Ben Holliday. It eventually had several owners. There was a family named Armstrong. He was a mining engineer, and he also liked to gamble, and he won this property from one of the former owners through a gambling experience. The Armstrongs lived here during the summers at first. And the person that he got it from, interestingly enough, had wanted to start a resort here. But it never worked out. He built about 5 cabins on the property. Well, the Armstrongs moved in, used one as a living room, one as a bedroom, one as a kitchen. And that was what they had here on the property. The father left the family and went to mining experiences in Mexico and never came back. So the mother and daughter ended up owning the property. They knew Mrs. Knight through church affiliation, and she would invite them over here for picnics. So they were exposed to it. Then her niece, about that in the late 20s, was married to this Swedish architect, and he built a home for his new bride in Rye, New York. Mrs. Knight saw that, and she was so impressed because it was a much smaller scale, but similar in many respects to Vikingsholm. And that's where she put the ideas together. If she could acquire the property and have him as the architect, she felt that this could be a very nice arrangement for Emerald Bay. And it turned out to be that way. That was built in the late 1800s, the Emerald Bay Resort. It was very well known, quite popular. The steamers used to come in and drop passengers off before they had a road around Emerald Bay. Yes.
So that was in existence when this?
That was in existence. The state acquired that after they got this property, and they took down the resort in 1958. It's now a campground.
And the other is, one time I thought I had heard that Mrs. Knight was somehow associated to the Morton Salt Empire. Is that not true?
He could have had some interest in that. They had, I mentioned a few things. The Moore brothers had controlling interests, and the big ones were Continental Can, Diamond Match, National Biscuit, Rock Island Railroad, Union Pacific, etc. But there were others, so. At the time we came to visit here, we lived in Santa Barbara also. We had a 1928 Buick, which we drove from Santa Barbara to Lake Tahoe. We had two routes. One was up 395, and that was always done at night because it was so hot and we didn't have any air conditioning, usually with a stopover at June Lake. The other was my favorite, which was to drive to San Francisco and then take the ferry boat up to Sacramento. The Delta Queen.
And there was a road always here coming down around. There was always a road.
Yeah, there was sort of. Yeah, but there was a lot with the car, a lot of boiling and radiators boiling over, and tires were a big concern.
So it took a while.
It was somewhat an agonizing trip. But believe me, it was worth it.
Yeah, of course.
All right, well, thank you very much, Helen.